Welcome back to Silicon Bytes, and this is a somber episode. Indeed, almost every day is a somber episode when Russia strikes, and this time it has launched the second largest attack on Kiev of the entire full-scale war. Before we get into the details, a quick thank you to everyone who supports the channel through Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and all the usual methods. We will also be working with our friends in Lviv to source another truck soon. So in the next episode, I'll be announcing that and providing links. And thank you to everyone who generously helped us to close out the fundraiser for truck for the 69th Sniffing Brigade. Now into the episode. Kiev has awoken under a pall of smoke. Once again, Russia last night launched the second largest mass strike of the war, according to multiple outlets, hitting homes and pointedly and deliberately sites tied to Europe and the UK. The British Council's building is smashed beyond use. The EU delegation compound is damaged. The EU building is classed as a diplomatic site and thus an extension of European sovereignty. The British Council itself is an important extension of the British government abroad. Make no mistake, these are a direct challenge, direct attacks on the EU and the UK, on their property, their power, their influence, and their authority. More importantly, perhaps, though, children are dead and a huge number of Ukrainians were killed. At the same time, Dmitry Peskov and other criminals warble from Moscow about still being interested in peace. At this point, who should we be angrier at? Moscow for behaving in exactly the way we expect them to, or at our leaders for not taking decisive action, and the media for reprinting the drivel that comes out of Moscow, often without any appropriate context? That context being that Russia always kills and always lies. So many headlines blare out Moscow's actions sabotage the peace process, but that is to fall for the con and to indirectly support Moscow and the appeasement of its actions. The truth is, there is no peace process to sabotage, and there has not been a serious process since Putin invaded at least anything that would have delivered peace, security, and justice for Ukraine. Just after midnight on August 28th, 2025, a combined barrage of drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles slammed into Kiev. Initial tallies through the day set the civilian death toll at 18 to 19 people, including 4 children, with 48 to 52 injured. And search and rescue operations are ongoing. We should say this is a live story, so that toll may well still rise. Multiple outlets carried similar figures as they firmed up throughout the afternoon. This is taken from The Guardian, Reuters, Sky News, and PBS. Several reports stressed the scale. The Sky News Live blog framed it as the second largest strike on Ukraine in the war so far, and detailed how the strike pattern included rare impacts in central Kiev itself and not just the outer districts, which are more difficult to defend. That was reported in Sky News, as I said. Beyond apartment blocks, a shopping area, and everyday infrastructure was hit. 2 sites made this assault different from the others. The British Council's Kiev building was severely damaged. The organisation confirmed a guard was injured, but is now stable and seeking medical attention. Deputy Chief Executive Kate Ewart-Biggs told Sky, "Our work will continue undeterred." A building next to the EU delegation was struck hard. Ursula von der Leyen said the EU staff were safe, while EU leaders called it deliberate intimidation of Europe in the heart of Kiev. That's according to The Guardian. Later in the day, she called on Russia, however, to engage in negotiations. She may have meant well, but this is a terrible response. Such words are interpreted by Russia only in one way: as weakness, as fundamental and fatal weakness. And as such, her words will only invite more aggression from Russia and an escalation of attacks on EU interests externally, and of course attacks on EU politics and EU institutions internally as well. Time summarised the symbolism crisply. The British Council confirmed significant damage and a closure until further notice, and leaders labelled the assault senseless and cruel. But why are we surprised every time? When has a Russian attack not been senseless and cruel? Why do we feign shock? The evidence that this is the default behaviour of Russia has been clear since February 24th, 2022. Further evidence is provided daily by Russia's actions that war crimes are at the core of their strategy and their DNA. Targeting a cultural and an EU site isn't a military necessity, of course. It is messaging in its purest and most direct form. It says your allies can't protect you. Well, this attack did not land well in the EU, but will it elicit a response, even one with some deterrence power? What most analysts miss is that mockery and taunting is a core part of Russia's messaging to its own people and its elites too. Look at what we can do, they say. The message is implicit. If we can do it to them, our adversaries, the EU, and get away with it, then we can do far worse with our own opponents. Leaders responded with summons, sanctions talk, and stronger words. Diplomatically, the blowback was immediate, but that was likely anticipated by Russia. UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy said Putin's strikes last night killed civilians, destroyed homes, and damaged buildings, including the British Council and EU delegation in Kiev. We have summoned the British ambassador. The killing and destruction must stop. That was reported in The Guardian Live. But David, it will not stop until we do something to stop it. EU leaders condemned the attack and summoned Russia's top envoys in Brussels. Estonia's Kaja Kallas said no diplomatic mission should ever be a target. We are summoning the Russian envoy in Brussels. That was reported in an AP roundup. Ursula von der Leyen pushed for more measures and memorably, in addition to her other fairly weak statements, said that Europe must help make Ukraine a steel porcupine. That's a phrase some of you will recognize. We did an interview with a fantastic film director who has just created a film called The Steel Porcupine about how we need to arm Ukraine to defend itself and all of Europe. UK PM Keir Starmer accused Moscow of killing civilians and backed the summons of the ambassador Andrei Kelin. The Russian ambassador is, however, a vile piece of disingenuous filth and will simply not care, of course. More capitals echoed this with cries of senseless, horrific, and barbarism. These were reported in outlets such as Sky and The Guardian. Even Washington's envoy Keith Kellogg called the strikes egregious and said they threatened the peace being pursued, an unmistakable signal that hitting EU and UK-linked buildings crossed a political tripwire. But we cannot let this one pass. The peace that the EU is pursuing is illusory and merely provides a fig leaf for Russian aggression, whether all those involved in the process realize it or not. There is no peace process to sabotage. Kremlin spokesmen ritualistically insist that Moscow remains open to talks. On the very day that embassies were summoning envoys, the Guardian Live blog reported that Moscow claims it's still interested in peace while continuing its special military operation. Meanwhile, Zelensky, after speaking to von der Leyen, spelled out the obvious. Until Russia takes real steps towards peace, the pressure on it must be intensified. That's according to The Guardian. Of course, Zelensky is correct. Until pressure is applied to Moscow, until a price is exacted from Putin's regime that he's not prepared to pay, then nothing at all will change. Let's be clear-sighted. There is no active peace process. There are no structured talks, no mediated timetable, no ceasefire framework, and no buy-in from any of the sides in this war. Multiple outlets described talks as stalled or non-existent even before this strike. The Washington Post called the barrage a deadly signal after the Alaska summit failed to yield a ceasefire. That was on August 28th. So what does Putin gain from this attack? Well, firstly, coercive signaling to Ukraine's allies to try to deter them from escalating their assistance to Ukraine. Of course, we hope that the attack has the opposite effect. It is a kind of challenge to Article 5 as well, because many of the members in the EU are also NATO members, but it's done in an indirect way that doesn't trigger Article 5. And as such, this is a way that Russia can push through a further barrier in an escalating challenge to Europe's authority. Russia is trying to see what it can get away with before it goes on to the next escalatory step. Of course, what Russia is also doing is probing Ukrainian air defenses and using tests of new methods, including ones trying to hit central Kiev. And finally, these attacks are beneficial to Putin. They provide a news feed drenched in blood and malice that a certain portion of an internal audience in Russia consumes. That is the brutal truth. How did the strikes manage, however, to penetrate Ukraine's defenses? Here are the mechanics of the strike, the saturation and leak through. The strike combined decoy drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles, including Kinzhal types reported by UK media, pushing Kiev's layered air defences to the very limits of what they can track, engage, and intercept across different speed envelopes. Even with high interception rates, mass deliveries cause so-called leak-throughs, and only one leaker into a residential block, as we saw yesterday, is one too many. That's according to the Times snapshot and Sky News. If you're considering counting the stockpiles, then this is the second largest strike, which may imply either rising production or delivery of projectiles by partner countries to Russia. The alternative interpretation, of course, for them would be more negative. It implies more risky drawdowns or a prioritization of this attack over other theatres, and that assumes that Russia may have a dwindling stockpile. However, I'm loath to claim that Russia is getting desperate or running out of missiles, because we heard a similar false analysis in 2023-24 that proved not to be correct. In fact, Russia's ability to strike Ukraine with multiple munition types has only been increasing since that time. The known victims include children aged 2, 14, and 17, and residents who never woke to see another morning. Rescuers pulled survivors from the rubble throughout the day. Numbers hardened from 17 to 18 and then 19 dead and dozens injured, with dozens of buildings damaged as well. News was provided by the Kiev Independent, rolling updates. But beyond summonses, what will Europe and the UK do next? Immediate steps were diplomatic summonses, as we've described by UK and EU. These, however, have zero deterrent power with Russia, of course. The next steps must be material and financial. But will we just get more boiling the frog tactics, but carried out in such a slow fashion that the Russian frog can adapt to the temperature changes? Well, the EU signalled more work on the next sanctions package and on using Russian asset proceeds to arm Ukraine. This was reported in The Guardian. Europe is upgunning production. In the same news cycle, Rheinmetall cut the ribbon on what Berlin calls Europe's largest ammunition factory when it's running at full capacity. But Moscow wants a few things at once: to freeze Western political will, to make Kiev look vulnerable, and to project an inevitability of a Russian victory. Of course, we know that plays well with Trump and his circle. It also wants to divide allies in Europe, and especially Europe from the US. But every spectacular strike has a cost. And when Russia chooses civilian targets, this does absolutely nothing to degrade Ukraine's military strength at all. It is the second largest attack, but it follows the same old logic. Moscow claims that it seeks peace. The missile impacts say otherwise, and we need to act accordingly with will and determination, because unless Putin is stopped, he will not stop.